I'm Doug Kelly, and I'm on faculty at ASU. I've been here a long time, since '94, however many years that is, and did my master's degree here. I actually have a master's in counseling, and my degree is actually in communication studies, but I have a lot of sociology friends because I study families, and I'm studying inner city families and immigrant families and such. So lots of overlap in terms of work. How we for all of you that have joined us, welcome. And we're just so glad to have you all with us. And yeah, so let me ask that if you're not speaking to the group, make sure that your microphones are muted. And we're going to take just a few minutes in case you didn't get a chance to see the preliminary videos. When I came into Huba this morning, I wasn't, for some reason, wasn't getting audio, but I had video. So so I got to see everybody and I didn't get to hear them. And I probably needed to log out and come back in. But at any rate, we're just going to we have 4 panelists here with us, and including myself, and we'll spend just a few minutes chatting, and then open up for discussion with everybody in the session, and between panelists as well. So I want to make sure that those of us who are kind of officially panelists are a part of that. I want to recognize Amy. How do you say your last name, Amy? Jacober?
Yes, Jacober.
Jacober, okay. And is co-hosting this event, so you may see her popping in and popping up, and kind of helping get questions to the forefront. So I wondered if, like, Elaine, since you've been front and center a bit, do you want to just for a second speak to everybody, and up to maybe 5 minutes or so, like however much you want to do. If you just want to talk for 2 or 3 minutes, that's okay. But for each of our panelists, you just tell everybody who you are. There was a very nice introduction to Elaine that you might have missed in a previous session by a renowned scholar. But otherwise, I'm going to let you do it on your own here. Okay, so Elaine, go ahead and take a few minutes.
Yeah, and I'll let you jump in, Douglas, if there's if I'm not saying the right kinds of things. But I'm Elaine Howard Eklund, and I am a professor of sociology and chair of social sciences at Rice University, and I also direct a program on religion and public life there, which I've been doing for the past 10 years. And really just excited to be here. I think as a sociologist, my own sense of Christian faith has often informed the kinds of research topics that I have picked. I've spent a lot of time studying how immigrants use religion in their lives, and I've also spent time studying what scientists think about religion. Some of that work done with Brandon. We've done an international study of scientists' attitudes towards religion in 8 different national contexts. And I've also spent a lot of time studying what different religious groups, both Christian groups, but also other religious traditions, people who have no tradition, how everyday people view science and scientific technologies. And some of our team's more recent work is very concerned with thinking through how the science and faith space might really get involved in issues of racial justice in science. And so we've turned our attention the last few years to that really important topic as well. I would love to just be in dialogue with any of you who want to be, so just excited about these questions.
Fabulous. All right. Brandon, why don't you share with us, and then we'll go to Amy.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I didn't really get a chance to do the 3-minute video for a number of reasons. So I can do a quick intro to my own background. So I'm currently Associate Professor and Chair of Sociology at the Catholic University of America. But I grew up Hindu, and I grew up in a Tamil Brahmin family, and was born and raised in the Middle East where my parents were working. And Brahmins, Hindu Brahmins place a lot of premium, a really high premium on science education in particular. My dad was an engineer, my mom was a doctor. And so, for them, at least in their version of Hinduism, there's no hint of conflict of any sort between faith and science. Or other, being a Tamil Brahmin meant basically that you would go into a science career. And in some of the research Elaine and I have done on scientists, in different countries, in India in particular, we find, the majority of Indian scientists tend to be from some kind of Brahmin background. And so when I was growing up, India opened its economy to foreign investment in the early 90s, and this was quickly followed by the IT boom. And everyone wanted to go into software engineering, and it was expected when I was a teenager that that's what I would do, that I would pursue computer science and become a software engineer. But I converted to Christianity just after high school, and this was in Dubai. And I moved to Canada for undergrad. And because of my conversion, I began to question why I was making the career choices that I took for granted. And I saw many of my friends and family who were working in tech corporations and engineering jobs in IBM and some of these big companies. I saw them as being really miserable. And I wanted to to understand the meaning of work and to discern what God was calling me to do. And in that process, I started studying how people from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, et cetera, thought about work. And I learned that to do this kind of inquiry, not just what one ought to do for work, but how people actually experience and make sense of work, and how their workplaces either help them or prevent them from flourishing. And from living integrated lives. So I learned that these were empirical questions that required training in sociological methods, and that's how I ended up becoming a sociologist. And I've really had, enjoyed the pleasure of working with Elaine on her studies of scientists. And so I think that has in some ways brought many things together for me. And I'm continuing to do some research on scientists, particularly on the role of aesthetics, so beauty, awe, and wonder in science, and how that relates to both faith and spirituality as well as to the practice of science. Let me just stop there.
Okay, so I think it's my turn.
Yep.
So I enter this from the other side. My academic journey is a PhD in theology, but then kind of going back for me, I also have, I'm a graduate of ASU as well, but with my MSW from ASU, and then sociology from University of Arizona. So I've been on kind of this, every time I was kind of looking at helping people and doing that, quite frankly, the sociological inquiry, I had questions of how does God fit in that? And when I was doing theology, it was the questions of, but so what? And so much of that, I didn't know for a long time, quite frankly, that there was any animosity between science and faith. I don't know that one or the other was necessarily promoted, but there didn't seem to be any animosity that I knew about. That was not something that I heard from my church growing up by any means. Where I started kind of seeing kind of maybe a bit of a tension is really when I started being a professor and teaching those who were going to go on to do youth ministry. And when I do youth ministry, because so many, and it's a whole variety of ages, if they're dissecting a frog and they'll come to then youth group and say, can we do this? Aren't we supposed to be caring for creation? And so there's that, and it's such a simple thing. Or they'll come and they'll say, oh, we're doing this incredible unit on the planets. And, and they'll say, where did God fit in that? And there's a lot of anxiety for youth pastors. And we have a long conversation about how do those things fit together? I think I had a distinct appreciation. My eldest daughter was born in congenital heart failure. And while we were at the hospital when she was, right as she was born, I was talking with the pediatric cardiologist. And this particular cardiologist, he was so kind, but he was also pretty arrogant. But what I have learned is a lot of pediatric surgeons are really arrogant. And I'm like, I kind of want you to be arrogant. I want you to have the confidence. Like, don't be a jerk, but I'm okay if you think that you're amazing, because I need you to be amazing. But so he's talking to me and we're trying to figure out how it's going to work. And he's talking to me about ECMO and all of these things that were overwhelming in general, but also being postpartum, and my daughter was tiny. And he made it about halfway across the room after he's told me they have to do open heart surgery, that there's some pretty terrible things that were going on. And he was pretty clinical. And then he turned around, and it's the same man in the same room. And he said, "You're a Christian, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "I need you to pray for me, because I have all the training in the world, but it's going to be God working through my hands and using my intellect. And I need to be on point the day I'm with your daughter." And he said, because as we know, God is the great physician. I just get to be the one who gets all the credit for it. And I thought, that was not what I was expecting. It was not something that I solicited. And it was just such an interesting kind of dance. I think one other quick, and this has been my learning curve, even as a parent, my children go to a Montessori school, and the littles, so the kinder and first graders, they do a timeline of life. And so the first time my daughter came home, and it's a Christian Montessori school, it's in an Episcopal church, and they said, "Hey, this is super cool. Did you know God made hominids too?" And I thought, I don't even know what a hominid is. I'm going to have to go back and look that one up. I've clearly forgotten. But for all of these children, and I'm actually now the chaplain at that school, there's no break between science and faith. They're an interaction between the two. And so I have now, in my teaching for adults, I invite my college and graduate students to not be afraid of one or the other, but to find ways to integrate.
Wow, fabulous. Thank you. Yeah. My academic journey was similar to yours in that I was at Tempe and ended down in Tucson. Those of you not from Arizona, those are the two rival schools. So ASU and Tempe, and the U of A down in Tucson. So I was actually a religious studies major. I came to Christ through the Young Life ministry. Those of you might be familiar with Young Life, and I'm still involved with that to some degree. And it's kind of a weird and wacky ministry in some ways. I've always kind of liked being on the fringe of things. I don't do very well on the core of places. So Young Life worked for me. I've always been on the edge of the church or working with other groups that way. And then I feel like a lot of the research that I've done what I've needed to for tenure and to get full professor, but a lot of what I write and do is a little bit risky and different compared to what some of my colleagues are doing. And so I have a master's in counseling and a PhD in communication studies. Really trained in family interpersonal communication. That's led, much like Elaine said, to me selecting certain kinds of topics. My faith, like most significantly, I mean, I was interested in family and all of that. Some of that was coming out of kind of my faith tradition and the high value on marriage and family and the churches that I was involved in. And then I've been doing over 20 years of research with a colleague on forgiveness and interpersonal relationships. That really came, I mean, talk about a little God thing. Like I had finished this one line of research on relational expectations in marriage and was just trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And so I thought I'd do this little forgiveness study, and it would be kind of fun just to kind of kill some time and and I thought it would be interesting. And then a colleague came up and said, hey, like, do you want to do more on this? And he had studied emotion in organizations. And so I'm like, yeah, let's do that. So at any rate, we've been messing around with forgiveness and reconciliation for a long period of time. I also, because I didn't really grow up in the church, the whole science, religion thing, like I just never had a problem with any of it. And I'm a fairly eclectic thinker. For those of you who might go into the academy, eclectic thinking is not always valued, right? You don't get tenure typically by thinking that way. You have to show that you have mastered a particular area. And I've had reviewers at times respond to me and tell me that using a particular theory or something might be inappropriate because I'm pulling theories from places that are untraditional or non-traditional. I have a recent article out. I've used a little bit, an opening quote from Cynthia Bourgeault, if you know that name by any chance. She's a contemplative Episcopalian. And from Parker Palmer, who's done a lot of consulting into the university and teaching, but also a contemplative Quaker. And they're embedded in that article as I talk about tension between dialectical poles that results in what I'm calling kind of a third way perspective. There are other names for it. Bourgeault calls it something different. And actually some early psych work back in the 70s refers to similar processes. And so mine has been, like, my first teaching job was at Seattle Pacific University, which is a sister school to, it's part of the Christian College Consortium. So Biola and Westmont and Wheaton College and all of those schools are kind of sister schools. And so that was really where I was first challenged to integrate, like to truly integrate faith and learning, not just like put a verse on your syllabus or start the morning with reading a verse and then go on. I never did any of that stuff, but how do I integrate what I'm thinking and how I think and this worldview that I have into the social science work that I'm doing. So that's been my journey, and I'll just mention real quickly that it's led into additional work with immigrant families. We have a project that's a little bit on hold with COVID right now, but that has been bringing evangelical congregants into undocumented family homes to share a meal and hear immigration stories. There's not a political agenda. It's a humanizing agenda. It's obviously that comes very much out of my own faith perspective. Elaine, you were mentioning that kind of work for you as well. And then I've done some work on intimacy and love. I've done some writing on that as well. But that honestly comes out of the fact that when I was in my early 20s, a mentor of mine talked to me about the fact that he really believed that what God wants with all of us is intimacy. And so out of a lot of that thinking has come the ideas of looking at love and God is love and creating a space where intimacy can happen and other kinds of thoughts like that. So we have the whole forgiveness thing going, but there's a lot else that we're having some fun with. What I'd like to do now is just open it up for questions, additional comments from panels or comments from you all that have joined us about your experience as it relates to this process of faith and science and how they're intertwined.
Are folks all sociologists on the call as well, or interested in sociology? These are the disciplinary tracks, right, Douglas?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
So if you want to let loose on sociology stuff, we'll go crazy. Will people share in the sociocultural anthropology?
Right.
Um,
Yeah, feel free to post in the chat, like if you don't want to voice your question.
Practical theology, sociology of religion and religious studies, other sociologists. Local church pastor who loves history and sociology of religion. Me too. Missiology, science and technology studies. So I'll ask the other panelists a question to get us warmed up, if that's okay. So Amy, I'm interested when you teach sociology in a primarily Christian environment, if there are struggles with sociology itself as a discipline. So I've sometimes taught Christian students who feel like sociology of religion. So essentially sociology is looking at group level behaviors, and kind of an axiom of sociology is that some of our reality is socially constructed, right? That the group has a huge impact on how the individual understands themselves, and even conditions us in certain ways that are almost beyond our free choice. And that is really hard for some types of Christians to try on, right? That a lot of what we think and believe may be socially constructed. And I've definitely encountered folks who think that this is actually very anti-Christian. And so I don't know if that's relevant at all to you, and if that comes up for people.
Yeah, it does. So in a couple of different ways, because I have been fortunate enough to be teaching in places that are Christian institutions, but they aren't covenantal. So you don't have to sign saying, here's what I believe in order to attend there. But I do get to begin and say, this is an institution that here's a value. And part of why we want to have sociology is around this. So I usually end up with about half and half in a class, which is a really interesting dance. I've had only Christians, I've had only non-Christians. Where I am currently, it's about half and half. And so I have half of the room that's very skeptical about Christianity. And they're like, listen, I'm only here to play ball. I got a scholarship. And so whatever. And then the flip side are the ones who are like, well, this is a required, and I always love this is required. And I'm like, great. I love that it's required for you, because I get to teach the intro class. What I have discovered, I do the intro class, and then I actually go on and I also get to teach the class on race, gender, and multicultural. And so often my most skeptical, like, I'm required and I'm here, it's almost like impress me. Often the more difficult they are in that arena are the ones who then tend to go on and take the next level, which has been super fun.
That's really neat. That's really neat.
But some of those who are, I do have to have this kind of conversation. So last spring when COVID was beginning, and there was an intensive course, and it was an odd kind of thing for a variety of reasons. But before they had even gone completely distance, we were meeting in person, and everyone in the class was super cool with like sitting at the far corners of class and being away from each other and, masked, except one student. And that one student was the one who kept saying, I'll do this because I'm supposed to, but I think it's ridiculous because this whole idea that we're all connected is ridiculous because God's made me unique. And I thought, ooh, you're very unique. And, he was really adamant. And then he started bringing in, as the term went along, and we had several non-Christians in class. As the term went along, he would say, well, at my church, we have been taught X, Y, Z. And he goes, and that's what's right. And I would say, well, what about this data? And he said, well, you know, statistics can be manipulated. And in my mind, I'm like, I know we're the people who know how to manipulate them, not you, you're 17. But I didn't say that, that's bad teaching. But he knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to actually enter into, you know, that virtue of humility and into conversation. He's one that really stands out to me. But I've certainly had lots who have been like that, trying to convince, in particular, students who are hyper individualistic. And even it's an amazing thing, because it's a Christian institution and I have the privilege of having a PhD in theology, I will always couch it around from those Christian students. Oh, look, did you know that the Bible was oral tradition? You couldn't, this whole idea of a quiet time by yourself didn't exist. That's a weird modern thing. And so we are communal and we are connected. And that ends up being a lot of the dance that I have with some of those deeply faithful Christian students, is they really, really are still in that space of going, well, I get that we're connected, but my God and my way of doing things. I think the only other, and then I will certainly stop. With it, when I'm doing sociology, both the intro course and the upper division ones, I always feel a little like the Grim Reaper, because I have a lot of students who will say, there's no such thing as systemic racism. There's no such thing as systemic, you know, sexism. And when I start showing them the data, they feel like they've been duped. And then they wonder in what other places they've been duped. And they don't know, then they kind of get to this space of going, well, who do I trust then? And if my church taught me that this doesn't exist, and my family taught me, and I've just met you, oh dear professor, and they feel like they're in a little bit of a free fall. And I think that's a really sacred space, regardless of your field. And I love that we have so many fields that are kind of represented here, because I think we could probably all have that conversation of what does it then do for us to invite them into looking at data faithfully, and then helping to create a better world from their particular space of interest.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for answering my
Great.
question.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah. We've got a couple of questions that came up in the chat. So let me read one of those, and we'll let anybody on the panel or anyone else who wants to take a shot do that. So from Steve, can you help explain why at least some sociologists, even some theist Christians, seem reticent about evaluating or judging ethical issues, whether via reason or scripture or other sources of knowledge? In my experience, it seems many prefer or choose to stay descriptive and forego prescriptive claims. Perhaps your experiences are different. By the way, I'm a philosophical theology by training, although I regularly interact with sociology colleagues via university committees, hanging out.
I could take a stab at that. I mean, I think historically in sociology, at least American sociology, there have been a couple of really dominant perspectives. So positivism is this sort of philosophy of science where essentially all you can do is, the only reality you can access is that which you can measure, and we really can't establish any kind of causality. It's all we have is statistical associations, and so you can measure stuff and say that things are related to other things. And that's been, I think, the dominant sort of meta theory in American sociology. And the only other alternative to it is a kind of interpretivist view that comes from Max Weber, which strongly holds to a fact-value split, and this idea that we shouldn't really be making any value judgments as sociology. It should be value neutral. So those approaches, I think, have been really dominant in American sociology, and recently they've been overturned by a more activist strand. And so I think the last few years in particular, sociologists have become much more prescriptive and much more activist. And so So I don't know how much of a concern this is in American sociology anymore, but certainly historically, there's a lot of influence for avoiding being prescriptive. I think it's harder these days. So people would say that there is much more prescription and public sociology and sort of activism that's denouncing injustice, for instance, right? And it's, people would say it's coming from a particular political perspective and so on. But I think in general, this is not currently a big issue in the field of American sociology. Anyway, that's my read on it. I don't know if others have a different take.
Yeah, that's my read on it as well. I wouldn't say much differently. I do think sociologists sometimes find it hard to recognize the kinds of values that we bring to the table when we set up our studies and when we do actually do our studies methodologically. Even our methods, I think, are infused with values. And then especially how we apply the research from our studies. And I've lately been trying to encourage students to be more transparent about their own positionality. It's somewhat popular to be transparent about your own positionality, things like your race and your class and your gender, and how they have an impact on your studies, but a little bit less popular to be transparent about other kinds of values and social locations. And so I think there's a kind of riff almost in the discipline. So there's a piece of the discipline that's kind of chasing the natural sciences and wants to be very much aligned with the natural sciences and the kind of power that the natural sciences have in the academy. And then there is a piece of the discipline, I think, that wants to be very activist oriented and really engaged in public sociology. And those aren't necessarily two completely separate positions, but we see those themes a lot in the discipline. And then just the last thing I would say about that is that we have to think about the kind of tools that sociology provides us. And I don't think that sociology is really the best, has the best set of tools to tell us how we ought to live in the world. But I do think that if you have goals and aims, that sociology then becomes very useful in helping us figure out how close or far we are from those aims.
I think the other, just to quickly add, the other thing that sociology helps shed light on, and maybe this is also, could add to some of the reticence to be prescriptive, is recognizing the unintended consequences of various kinds of interventions and policies and so on, which, the current activist strand seems a little blind to, but there's also a tradition in sociology and some of the other social sciences to be careful of, if you think this policy is going to solve this problem, think about historically what we know about what has happened whenever these kinds of policies have been implemented, the unintended consequences and so on.
So we have about 10 minutes left. There's a question really directed to you, Elaine, from some of the work that you referenced last night. From Alistair. My question is about the research that you've done on the faith of scientists around the world. In the UK, you note that 35% of scientists in elite institutions view science and faith as in conflict. Do most of the rest view theology as operating on a different level, perhaps of meaning or belief, which tends to sustain a gap between science and faith? How do those who hold science and faith to be integrated and in concord respond to those who either view it as conflict or compartmentalized?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it looks like you've read our book, Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Think About Religion, because I didn't mention that last night. So cool. Just want to affirm people who actually read academic books. So yes, you're getting that data from a pretty thin question, a survey question where we asked how people see these big bodies of knowledge and ideas of science and religion in relationship to one another. The modal response, or the response that people choose most often, actually in most of the nations we studied, is one of independence, that they see science and religion as different parts of reality. So that's one kind of response to your question. And I think another thing that is relevant here is that our research has uncovered that there's quite a bit of diversity in the scientific community, but there's not much open discussion, diversity of thought rather, about the relationship between science and religion. But there's also, especially in the UK, not much open discussion about the connection between science and religion. And that's interesting to us. Brandon and I have actually talked about this offline several times. That's very interesting because, you know, historically, many of the great universities in the UK have religious roots. There are very active theology programs and religious studies programs as well, increasingly. And so there is a real possibility structurally for there to be some interesting dialogue across disciplines. And there certainly are excellent movements afoot to see that happen. We could talk about this one a lot, so maybe I ought to move on, but feel welcome to text us or WOVA us. Is that a thing now, WOVA? I mean, is that as a verb? I don't know. Carry on, Douglas.
All right. So Peter Sherman's offering this. Peter Berger was a big influence in my studies, and he was the father of the social construction of reality and a Christian. He always said that there was a reality beyond the social constructions. He also said the approach relativizes the relativizers. We are all influenced by social location, even sociologists. The key for a Christian is not to turn social construction into reductionism. Do you see yourself as a scientist? I'm more qualitative in my method, and so I don't think of myself in that category too much. So kind of a second part.
Yeah, I've been maybe perhaps talking too much, but just to jump in quickly, I agree very much. And so I don't think that even in Berger's own writings, he was saying that there isn't a truth or that there isn't a reality. I think he is more, I see Berger's approach as more a standpoint of humility, that it's not possible for us to know fully what that reality is, and that we are very influenced by the social groups and social locations we have, and others have taken his ideas in different kinds of directions. So I see myself as a scientist dependent on who is asking the question and who I'm in relationship to. So that is, how's that for social construction for you? I can go on, but perhaps Brandon might still want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably see myself as a social scientist. You know, I think social science provides a set of tools that I use to study certain problems, and it's not the only, you know, the scientific. I mean, again, how do you define science is a thorny question, right? So, if you want to say we define science by the application of something like the scientific method and so on, observation and, you know, hypothesis and that sort of thing, even that's contested. But, you know, that is part of my toolkit, and I use that to study certain things. But there are philosophical conversations to be had, you know, and how do we understand, even, you know, if it's a question like systemic racism, right? So that's a big issue right now. There are philosophical questions. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean for social systems to cause something? How do we assess that? You know, is that something that could be measured? And if so, how would one go about measuring it? So there's scientific questions there that we have to ask, and methods that we would have to use, and those methods are limited. I think it's, you know, part of my job and Elaine's job to help, you know, use these methods as best as we can, and then recognize the limitations where those exist.
So I get to be a part of, there's an international association, and it's for the study of youth ministry. So we lovingly say we have the worst acronym ever because it's IASYM, so it's IASM. But it's this really robust group of academics and practitioners from around the world. And quite frankly, it's more academic than a lot of academic conferences I've been to. But so when it's such an odd thing because it's youth ministry, and a lot of people think, oh, that's not that big of a deal. But if you can reframe it for youth work at the most formative stages of a person's life for how they're going to be viewing the world, which is, you know, how we like to look at it. We all do a lot of the same questioning, but my European and African colleagues tend to do it. They still say that they're doing practical theology, but it's almost straight up sociology. But they will say, here's why it's practical theology. And let's talk a little bit about theology. Now, the flip side, in the United States, in Canada, and some of our colleagues across Asia, they will do more a theological take. They'll call it theology, but they're doing the same exact kinds of studies, but the interpretive lens is a little bit different. And so we have this ongoing dance back and forth that is always about, is this science? Is this theology? What does that look like? How does that play out? And so I think there is an ongoing conversation. So.
Yeah, I know
that was
for
my
me,
daughter singing as she went by.
Oh. I was going to say, for me, I was trained as a quantitative researcher and by some of the top folks in our field. And then one of the beauties of especially when we think of a socially constructed reality, is triangulating what we're studying, looking at it in different kinds of ways. So I've moved into qualitative work, but I still, I mean, I consider that, because I'm always concerned that it's rigorous. I'm concerned, like when I review qualitative articles, even though I've done it, I'm always asking people, like, how do I know that if it was me instead of you doing this, that I would come to the same conclusions? Like, convince me that this is done with some rigor, that I should think about it, right? This isn't just an opinion piece about whatever. So I would make less sharp distinctions at times, or I would probably hold the social science banner broadly in some ways, maybe more broadly than some people would like to. I have friends that are pretty tight on on that. But like, I just did an autoethnography this last year, and which I have absolutely no training in. So I read a book by somebody that I really like and thought, I can do this, and I did. And that, you know, it came out, it was fabulous, it was fun. But I had definitely had my social scientist lens on as I was analyzing and going through my story, and so can I generalize from that? Can I, like, no, you know, not totally, but are people going to relate to it? For sure. I probably had more response to that piece than a lot of the pieces with numbers in it. And then if there's certain things that it's kind of a heuristic piece in a sense, right? That it kind of keeps us thinking, allows people to say, hey, I'd like to construct a scale and go figure that out. So that would be mine. I have just a short anecdote, by the way, on the social constructionist thing. I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of years ago who told me that he just reads the Bible and then does what it tells him to. And I said, like, well, but you he's a white male. Not that that necessarily has anything to do with it, but I'm like, you read that with some filters. And he's like, no, I don't. And I'm like, you don't? Like, so which translation do you use? Because they had filters too when they were translating this thing. And so it was like he was just convinced that he just reads it, it says to do this, and he does that, and it's not filtered in any way by his culture, by being male, by being white, by being 6 foot
Douglas,
tall, whatever.
You just described the difference between modernity and post-modernity for pastors, theologians, and professors.
Yeah.
That's the unending conversation.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. There's such great fear at times that if you start moving to a place where there's something that's constructed, the social construction part, right, that we have filters, like, where does that stop, right? I mean, I think that's, a lot of people are afraid of that. Like, I could give you a little bit of that, except when does it stop? Pretty soon you're gonna, everything up in the Bible's up for grabs now, because it's all filtered, and there's this fear somehow that there's no truth. I use some quotes out of The Abolition of Man from C.S. Lewis at times. Here's a great little story in the beginning of that book about it's an English text, I think, that is basically these authors are saying that, someone's looking at a waterfall and says that it's sublime, and they're saying like, well, what you're really describing is you feel sublime when you look at the waterfall. But Lewis just takes it to task and just is like, if you can stand in front of a waterfall and not think that's pretty awesome, there's something wrong, right? That this is innate kind of in our core of who we are. So anyway, I love to play with students on that. And there's sort of a practicality to that too, because I always tell them, even if you don't believe there's universal truth or a reality out there, you live as though there is. You make choices every day that live in a practical way as if those things are there. So that's not a good philosophical argument, but it's helpful for a lot of my students. And we're out of time. I'm glad to just sit here and keep this account open. If some of you have further questions, I don't know our panelists if you all have to go, but if you want to keep this rolling for a few minutes, I'm welcome to.
I have to go off to another a session in just a minute. Douglas, that was really wonderful. The only thing I would add is that it seems like, at least from the point of view of sociology, there are better and worse methods for the particular kinds of research questions you're asking. And I think we can learn some things from biblical interpretation, right? That there are more faithful and less faithful interpretations. There is a community of scholars and believers and theologians and however you think about that community, who are part of these debates. And I think of scholarship that way in my own field of sociology as well, that I'm only ever aware partially of my weaknesses, right? There are many weaknesses I have that as a scholar that I don't even know that I have. And so it's really important to get different kinds of scholars together, because our own social locations do matter, to give us a particular perspective. So I'm a kind of champion for that, for doing research in community in that way.
Absolutely. And I do think that's so core for people to know and to hear, that people who feel like that just any idea goes now, right? Every opinion is equally valid, or, and no one's saying that, so yeah, the questions, I think that obviously we're limited by what kind of questions we can ask to some degree within social sciences. We have, my colleague and I have a theory called negotiated morality theory, but it's a theory about how we negotiate morality, not about what your morality should be. Back to the former question about it being descriptive and such. So that doesn't mean that all moralities are equal, right? It's just, that's not the point of the theory.
Yeah, I think that kind of work provides some fruitful sort of fodder for collaborative work, right, Doug? I mean, I would imagine, I mean, this is where sociology and either, theologian, whether systematic theologians or practical theologians, could collaborate, right, on how do you integrate social scientific and empirical work with theology. So
absolutely.
Well,
thank you all.
Champion that. Mine is actually in systematics, but we had the option of, we had to do, so it was a lot of extra work, but it was systematics. And then, so what? So the methodology was practical theology. I 100% agree.
Yeah, but there's, it's interesting because in your talk about practical theology and people's response to that sometimes and everything, like in the communication field, there's a section of it that's applied communication. And, for some, like if it says applied, that it's a little less pure scholarship in their mind because it has a practical application to it, or you're demonstrating that application. Some of that's changing. That's one of the nice things about the communication fields. They're pretty progressive. They were open to qualitative work very early. And probably because our roots come out of rhetoric also. So we haven't lost all of that, but yeah, so working that applied part into it, or practical theology, or, you know, all of those things, I think can be challenging, especially in the academy at times.
Thank you very much indeed. I have to disappear. Thanks for your time.
Great, thank you. Glad you're here, Alistair.